Okay, well, yeah, thanks, and all the usual sort of thanks for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to share my ongoing research with you, even in these difficult circumstances. So let me just let me see how I advance these things. Okay, so let me just give you an outline of talk so it's easy for you to follow. So basically what I'm going to do is there's three parts. I'm going to sort of give you an overview of, the sort of the situation that's going on in psychology, the problem that has been motivated by what's going on in psychology, and then the solution that I give in my book that came out last year, 2018. I have to do that way. Okay. Then I'm going to say a bit about where we've come from in terms of the way we've thought about the mind, in the philosophy of mind, or in philosophy before it became, before psychology branched off to being, the area of science that works with psychological properties. And then finally, I'll say something about the direction that psychology is going. Let me just, I keep moving my cursor. Okay, so let me just start where we're at this moment in time. So let me just give you a couple of sentences. We all like displayed sentences. And in these particular sentences, what I'm displaying is the use of a cognitive term across various species, right? So in this particular sentence, this is from developmental psychology, where the scientists were testing infants, and they say, the infants that were habituated to 2 jumps of a puppet dishabituated when shown 3 jumps, and vice versa. And then you have another same use of the term, at least what appears to be the same use of the term, with reference to a different experiment, and this time this is in neuroscience, where the scientists are reporting on the time course of habituation of a particular neuron that they're doing a single cell recording of, and that its habituation was different from the habituation of a different neuron. So, you also have, so that's just a term, habituation, but you also have terms like, prefers, right? So again, from the developmental literature, you have 6-month-old infants can discriminate attractive from unattractive faces, and they prefer attractive faces of diverse types. You have capuchin monkeys, right, who prefer fruit, but if they have to, they will eat tree bark. You have rats that are allowed to search for food, and they have, they prefer chocolate pellets to their ordinary rat chow. And then you also have neurons, which prefer inputs with certain frequencies over inputs with other frequencies. So these are all displayed sentences. We use them throughout our own writings. But let me just to give you a sense of the context in which these sentences are kind of plucked out of. So this is a stimulus that you might see, maybe some of you have seen, in a sort of a standard, cognitive psychological tasks involving, undergraduates and other people, where you've got a bunch of dots moving. I didn't embed a video here because it just messes things up, but you can get the idea. So these dots are, you as a subject in this sort of an experiment will be looking at a computer screen with something like this on it, and the dots will be moving in a certain percentage of them will be moving randomly, and another percentage will be moving either towards the left, and that's the arrow here, or to the right, and that's the arrow here. And your task in this particular experiment is to choose, to decide which is the direction that the dots moving coherently are moving. So they're either moving to the left or they're moving to the right. And once you've made your decision about that direction of coherent movement, you press your computer key. And when it's an easy stimulus, so for example, the percentage of dots that are moving coherently in either in one direction or the other is pretty large relative to the total number of dots. In those easy tasks, you can do this task very quickly and very accurately. But once things get a little bit more difficult, and this is what the scientists will be manipulating, so you have a lot of randomly moving dots and very few that are moving in one coherent direction. You either have to slow down to make your decision, right? Or if you do it fast, your accuracy is going to suffer. And this trade-off between speed and accuracy, which shows up in the hard, in the hard cases, is just called the speed accuracy trade-off. And it's a very robust result that's been found across, it's first found in humans, or at least first graphed in humans. And it's been associated with, found in a lot of different species. This particular stimulus, in fact, was used, I took from a paper that looked at the speed accuracy trade-off in macaque monkeys. Okay, so where's my cursor? There we go. So Roger Ratcliff, developed a mathematical model of the speed accuracy trade-off. Okay, hopefully we're okay. Where you have two linked equations, one of which, traces the curve of your reaction time, and the other of which traces the fraction of correct choices, your accuracy. And so they're both functions of the stimulus strength. In other words, how difficult or easy is it to make the decision, right, in those particular circumstances. So versions of these equations are used throughout psychology. And one of the ways in which they have been used was in decision-making in fruit flies, right? So there's been a recent paper in Science where what they did was they looked at FOXP mutant fruit flies compared to wild-type fruit flies. The FOXP gene, in case you may or may not have heard of it, the FOXP gene in human beings affects our language skills. So, in terms of, actually being able to process language. And so what these scientists were doing was seeing, well, they were using the fruit fly as a model of decision-making, an animal model of decision-making, in order to see, does the FOXP gene also have any link to decision-making, as opposed to like language, which we already have known. And so they used the Drift-Diffusion model of speed and accuracy in decision-making. They compared the behavior of the two groups of fruit flies, the ones that had the FOXP mutation and those that were just plain old wild-type fruit flies. And what they found, this is just a partial bit, there's other, was that, when the stimulus, in their case, they used a stimulus that was olfactory rather than visual. So easy was where a particular odor that they have been trained to avoid was very, very dominant in the mixture, in the air. And the hard stimulus was when there were just really small amounts of this particular odor. So they found that, as far as accuracy, that was, as it got harder, they both, were less accurate, as one might predict. But what they found, a significant difference, which is this part here, was that, when you had a hard concentration, right, the decision was difficult, they found that the wild-type flies took a lot longer to make the decision, right? So as they report here, the FOXP mutants, they distinguish the stimulus, with the same accuracy, but they took longer to decide, right? No big difference, but you could see the big difference when it got very hard, right? So as they put it, it was glaring and difficult tasks. So this is the sort of scientific background that the sentences that I displayed before are being drawn from, right? And I should say, you know, this idea of decision making is not, fruit flies, macaques, but also people have also looked at it in slime mold, right? And and the proposal is that actually speed accuracy trade-offs in decision making are a biological phenomenon, right, throughout biology. And all of this is, sort of in dispute. It's, there's the usual back and forth of science going on here. But what's interesting, and this has been since, I guess, at least since the late 60s or early 70s, is that you've had a huge increase of species that are being looked at. So it's not just the sort of the charismatic megafauna that we're all, familiar with, like chimpanzees or like dolphins or porpoises or whales. More recently, I mean, people have now assimilated the idea that birds are actually intelligent, very smart. But this, this is only from the 90s. You have to realize that people have been looking seriously at birds, in terms of their cognitive capacities since, the mid 90s, Nicola Clayton and her colleagues, for example. But more recently, you've probably heard about, consciousness and other features in octopi. They're kind of the latest, species that is being included in the cognitive club. And you also have, again, you have biologists looking at bacteria and their capacities, and even plants. So one researcher at the University of Sydney, has reported being able to condition plants, right? Associative conditioning, right? Which is a simple form of learning, right? So there's a lot of different species, across biology, and also a large number of capacities too, right? So it's just, anticipating things, preferring things, wanting and desiring, making decisions, making inferences of various types, communicating linguistically, right, including with versions of recursion. There's episodic memory, with the birds. There's numerical cognition. There's social cognition. Which species have theory of mind and so forth. So there's a lot of different capacities, a lot of different species. There's been an explosion, I'd say, since roughly the early 70s or late 60s. And what's changed with all this, right, is first of all, as I mentioned, the extension in terms of the range of species being looked at. It's not just like pigeons and rats and chimps. It's systematic. It's not like, you've got one sentence appearing. That was, I sort of went through some of the background of the sorts of research that's going on. There's systematic uses. If one lab looks at this particular species of corvid to see if they have episodic memory, another lab will look at a different species and compare them, and so forth. It's specific to particular capacities, so it's not just sort of a, rampant, belief, desire, intention, psychology being, kind of splashed all over the place. It's people looking at specific capacities and designing experiments to look at those capacities, which is, if you're going to do it scientifically, you need to be able to articulate hypotheses that you can test. And in order to do that, you need to develop operationalizations of those capacities, behavioral measures, right, that are in some way specific to the capacity. The context, this is another important point. These are, I'm only talking about the language and the uses from scientists, from peer-reviewed scientific context. So I'm not talking about pedagogy, right, where people are using, language in all kinds of ways. I'm not talking about popular science, right, that you might read in, the Times of London or the Guardian or whatever. These are the sorts of contexts that you expect to be as, fact stating as one might want, right? Sort of the paradigm of fact stating discourse. And finally, you've got a whole lot of different new sources of evidence, right? You've got the use of mathematical models. You've got ecologically valid experiments where, as I sort of mentioned with the fruit fly case, they didn't use a visual stimulus, they used a odor stimulus because, flies are really good at detecting odors, right? You've got comparisons across species by using neurobiology, various neural structures. And then, of course, you've got comparisons at the genetic level as well. I mentioned this FOXP gene, which we have, but also fruit flies and a lot of other species have, right? So this all raises a puzzle, right? And this is the initial puzzle, right? How should we understand what these cognitive concepts, predicates, how should we understand what they mean, right? What they're referring to in these scientific contexts. And you can divide that into three, it's a complicated puzzle. It has various issues. One of them is just the straightforward semantic one. Are these terms, being used literally, as opposed to, say, metaphorically or in some odd way? Metaphysical issue, what are the capacities that they're referring to, right? If we're talking about the decision-making of fruit flies and macaques and slime molds and human beings, what is this capacity? And third of all, you have epistemic issue, which is what's the sort of evidence that matters for answering these two questions. So keep losing my cursor. There we go. So my response, as I mentioned, I call it literalism, and this I defend this more at length in my book. But the idea, taking those questions in reverse order, what sort of evidence matters most? Well, basically scientific evidence over traditional evidence. And this is, something that we've largely accepted since Galileo, basically. Second is, the metaphysical issue, what are the capacities that they're referring to? And here I call my view anti-exceptionalism, which is that you're referring to the same capacity across both human and non-human domains. And then the third, the semantic issue, of course, follows from these, which is, are these terms being used literally? And so that's why I call the view literalism. So it's, yes, they are, and they have the same reference. Okay, and just, much of the rest of the talk will be focusing on this metaphysical issue. What are the capacities? But just to, very briefly give you a sense, let me see if somebody has any hands up. No, great, okay. Okay, so just quickly a contrasting answer, so you can fix a bit on what the debate is or how it might go. A contrasting answer might be that the kind of evidence that matters is, tradition in some way. We've introspected about cognitive capacities in ourselves for a while. We observe, right? We make comparisons based on those observations. And that's the long tradition, right? And that's just what, these cognitive terms refer to. The metaphysical issue, what capacity to refer to. Very frequently, you will see something like, we have one capacity and it's very sophisticated or advanced or whatever. And then the non-human is often, either primitive or pseudo or proto or minimal or something lesser than the human capacity. And where's my cursor? There we go. And then, of course, the semantic issue might be, are these being used literally? No, there's some difference in meaning. What exactly it's going to be? There are a variety of different ways of answering that. You might say it's metaphorical. You might say it's nonsense, like Bonnet and Hacker. You might just say that they've revised it in certain ways, but it's not really referring to the real thing. Like real decision making is what we do. And whatever macaques and fruit flies do, it's not the real thing. Okay, so basically you can think of the problem that's being raised, at least the metaphysical aspect, as the mind problem. So we're all familiar with the mind problem, of course, which is about the relationship between the mind and the body. Popular answer today is materialism, as opposed to say some particularly substance dualism. And this answer is about the relationship, right? So you're assuming some sort of an acceptable account of what the mind is and what the body is, right? And there will be different answers to those two questions. Well, that's, sometimes called, what is body? What are different kinds of body? How are these different kinds of body related? Again, a popular answer today is physicalism, right? Body is whatever physics tells us it is. And of course, there are debates here. What is it, a priori, a posteriori physicalism, or is it contemporary physics, or some future metaphysics, or some future physics, right? So there's plenty of debate going on here. But one thing that's not really questioned is the idea that if we're talking about, physicalism, we're talking about scientific physics. We're not talking about folk physics, right? And that's just kind of taken for granted, but it's worth pointing out. And then you've got, of course, on the other side, you've got the mind problem, right? Which is, what is mind? What are different kinds of minds? And how are these different kinds of minds related? And here, again, you've got a popular answer is functionalism. That's what minds are. They're defined functionally. But in any case, there's still debate here, I think, what exactly type of psychology we're talking about. But if you follow the same route as, we do with body, then what you're going to look to is scientific psychology for answering the question. And you're not going to look at, folk or vernacular psychology. And this is part of what I mean when I said before, the epistemic question, what takes precedence, science over tradition? This is one of the questions that this is answering, is that if we're looking at kinds of minds and we're trying to see how they're related, the inquiry that we should be looking at is what's going on in science. Okay, so that's kind of the question that we're facing, that psychologists are struggling with right now. And when I say psychologists, I'm talking about comparative psychology, developmental psychology, cognitive psychology, all these different areas of psychology are all contributing, right? They're all, so you will have studies that have both infants and chimps, pre-linguistic infants and chimps in the same study, right? Doing the same task, right? You have people contributing from various parts of psychology, all to the same end of determining what capacities do what species have at what stage in their life cycle. So this is scientific psychology right now. But what's interesting is, this is part two, is what is the history that that psychologists are now struggling to kind of, in my view, are trying to overcome. And this is the history that we're kind of more familiar with. It's a very, from the contemporary perspective, a very anthropocentric history. So, good place to start is Aristotle. So, for example, again, we're familiar with this. According to Aristotle, everything alive had some sort of soul. But of course, he gave a hierarchy, right? So you had at the very bottom, anything alive had right, the nutritive soul. On top of that, you had the animals, but not the plants who had sensitive soul. They have, basically perception. And so they had both things. And then at the very top, you had the rational soul, which was exclusive to humans, right? So humans had everything below the rational soul or nous, but anything here, plants did not have above, and so forth. So it was a very nice hierarchy in which, basically mind is exclusive to human beings, or at least cognition. And maybe not perception, but certainly cognition. I keep losing this. Okay. So there's a number of different ways in which this whole framework for thinking about mind, of answering the mind problem, there's a number of ways in which it's anthropocentric. One is methodologically, so how do we know that this is the right way to order nature? Well, we observe ourselves and other human beings, and then we compare this to what we observe of other creatures, right? There's certainly no experimentation or design that we have today, but it's basically a naive sort of observation. The result of this is knowledge about mind, right? So there's no, or justified true belief, if you prefer that. So the idea is that, we observe ourselves either directly or, other people. And this observation provides us with knowledge, right, of my mind and of others' minds as well. Metaphysically, right, what is mind, or what is a particular capacity? It's what this observation tells us it is, right? And then how are these things related? Well, we have that hierarchy of souls, right? And in that hierarchy, mind is just to humans, the rational soul, nous, and it's on top, right? I mean, that's not a mistake, right? I mean, there's an implication of superiority in the design of the hierarchy. Now, obviously, this sort of thing gets taken to its extreme by Descartes, right? But it's a familiar picture. So he adds, Descartes even goes farther in the sense that he takes the sensitive soul, perception, and he says, well, actually only humans even sense, right? So we not only have all the cognitive stuff, but we have the perceptual stuff too, and animals are just, machines, right? He also adds, the whole divine, God as explaining why things are this way, which wasn't part of Aristotle's original model. And of course, as we know, he reifies the mind as a particular mental substance that, only humans have, right? Our bodies are just machines, but mind is imbued in us, right, by God. But that's just an extreme of the same sort of basic, from a very basic anthropocentric picture, is the same picture, right? And this gets elaborated even more and justified, with religious backing in the Scala Naturae, again, which you're probably familiar with to some extent, which is an ordering, a linear ordering of all of nature, completely is unoccupied, and it's ordered by degrees of perfection, right? With, as you can see here, the human being is at the top of the ladder, ranging down from the different, animals. As you see here, dog, eagle, I can't even tell what these things are, but in any case, right? Now the Scala includes, divinities at the top and, devils and such at the bottom. But if you take that off, basically you're getting a linear hierarchy of, with man, and then the other, non-human animals ranged by, in this case, degrees of perfection, right? Metaphysical perfection with God the Creator at the top. Again, humans are the ones at the top. Everything else is ranged underneath us, and part of what makes us superior, more perfect, is that we have minds that are closer to divine minds. Okay, so with evolution, right, you get the potential for a fundamental change in this picture of mind and nature, right? And I say potential because this is exactly what psychology is struggling to actually realize. So one of the key principles of evolution just says that there's no goal, right? Nothing is progressing to anything. It's just, you know, species evolve, right, in their niches, right? And they develop the capacities that they need to survive and flourish in their niches, right? So it's not like a linear progression that in which the human is like the goal, right? And every species will have what it has because those capacities help it operate and flourish and are adaptive to its particular problems and potentials in the niche that it occupies. Okay, so this view, as Darwin, you know, and some of his colleagues famously advocated, supports the idea of psychological continuity, right? I mean, you know, our minds are just evolved just like other minds, and there's a continuity, right, across biology of psychological features. But of course, this raises the question, well, how about the obvious differences, right? I mean, it's not like, you know, it's not like psychological continuity gives you identity across biology. But how do you explain this, right? How do you explain this sort of sense of human cognitive uniqueness and particularly superiority once you've lost the Scala Naturae to give you that metaphysical backing of degrees of perfection, right? You don't have that anymore. So how do you justify the ordering that we sort of intuitively have about what minds are, what human minds are, and how they compare to non-human species? So this is kind of the problem that psychology is dealing with. So Darwin, you know, again, you know, one of the ways in which the problem that's being faced is articulated is he voices an opponent right here because he believes in some sort of continuity where he says, well, this opponent might say that an anthropomorphous ape might say, well, I can use, you know, stones to fight or to break open nuts, but the idea that I could, you know, make a tool, right, is beyond me, right? So we can make tools, they can't. And then again, you know, some apes might say, you know, I'm going to aid my fellow apes in my same troop. So I have a certain amount of, you know, ability to operate socially. But men, in contrast, have a disinterested love for all living creatures, right? It doesn't matter if these things are true or false or not. It's just the expression that even though we might admit that non-humans have some aspects of, you know, rationality or cognition or nous or whatever it is that you want to call the stuff, that kind of stuff, there's still a difference there, and that makes us able to do more. And so you end up with a kind of a ladder, but it's a ladder that has no grounding. It's the Scala Naturae is gone, and so it's just standing on nothing, right? So what you have is this conceptual framework in which, you know, humans are the fully minded things. We make tools. We love everything. Apes can use tools, but they can't make them, and they love their close, you know, tribe, but they don't love every chimp, for example. And of course, the fruit flies forget it. I mean, they're just, you know. And so you can kind of see how this is very actually reminiscent of Aristotle's, you know, original hierarchy. I mean, it's not all that different from an anthropocentric perspective. And so what you end up with, right, in this sort of first way of thinking about, well, how are we going to deal with evolution and with the loss of the latter? you end up with the same sort of anthropocentrism, but it's now sort of put in Darwinian ways, right? So you get less minded instead of mindless, right? So you have, differences in method, that's for sure, right? So now you have all the tools of biology to look, to make your investigation, to make comparisons between brains and so forth. But the fundamental aspects of the anthropocentrism really have not changed, or at least initially, right? So the human mind is still, right, what we think, what we intuit or introspect, and we still know what other minds are by similarity or dissimilarity to that. What the capacities are, the human capacities remain the standard for what is like real or full. And then others are defined in relation to that. So they have less of whatever it is that we have. And then in terms of a structure, you get a sort of a, Scala-ish type of tree. I mean, you get a tree, but the human mind still remains, right, in these sort of fundamental ways unique, or at least claim to be unique, or it's certainly claimed to be superior, or both of these things. And this, so this general sort of, again, conceptual framework, is very persistent, right? So Dobzhansky, one of the founders of the modern synthesis of biology, in 1973, would say things like, man is still the apex of evolution. Why? Because only human beings can make conscious decisions, right? Now, Dobzhansky, of all people, should know that there is no apex of evolution. They're just, again, evolution doesn't progress to anything, right? There's no apex there. And can only human beings make conscious decisions? Well, apparently, it seems like certainly macaques and maybe fruit flies can make decisions. Consciousness is its own sort of ball of, wax, a horrible thing to figure out. But still, I mean, this is this way of thinking about the relation of human mind to any other mind is still reminiscent of the history, that we've gotten from Aristotle. And since then, you've had, people like Jane Goodall. Well, was man the tool maker? Well, she found in the, 1968, I think, or 69, reporting that the chimp troops that she observed in the Gombe Reserve were making tools. They weren't just using tools to break open nuts. They were actually making them, right? And even today, right, you've got people arguing that, Darwin made a mistake, that there is continuity, but there's a gap, right? And what is that gap to them? To them, it's based on, we have the ability, and alone have the ability to think about higher order abstract relations. But of course, it's found that, at least some other species are able to think in terms of abstract relations, or at least they behave in ways that people will infer, say, they are able to cognize in terms of relations of like sameness and difference, things like that. You also have David Premack, right? Maybe the difference here is, that in many ways we're similar, but we are able to use our capacities for planning, or for, engaging in episodic memory and things like that. We have the capacity to do this over a lot of domains. So it's domain general, whereas for animals, if they have these capacities at all, it's just specific to a particular domain. So for example, crows, may have episodic memory, but they only have it for caching food, right? For food that they've hidden. Whereas we have this ability to use remember anything, basically. And, interestingly, when he, poses the question about, how are humans different, and same, he says, well, it's essential when claiming human-like capacities in animals to ask this question: is the animal faculty equivalent to that of the human? And, this question, basically expresses this idea that I was saying before, that, the human capacity is used as the standard, right? And we look at other mammals, can they do what we do? Now, this is changing, right? But this is the struggle that I'm focusing on. So it's interesting, why would you even be asking that question? Right? So, from an evolutionary perspective, right, there's no reason why any species specific mind, the human or any other, should be the reference for the nature of mind. In other words, if you want to know what walking is, right, you don't say, well, human walking is real walking, and then anything else, either approximates or doesn't approximate how humans walk, right? And you wouldn't do that with vision, right? We don't do it with vision, right? Human vision is one type of vision. It's not the standard for vision, right? So you have, the same sort of capacity across lots of species, but you're not using the human version as the standard for what real vision is or what the best vision is or any of that stuff. So this is kind of where we're going, and I'm almost finished here. So what is being developed now is, and I say a non-random walk, because there is a lot of trial and error and exploration, right? So standard scientific procedure, but the direction is towards a non-anthropocentric psychology. And by what I mean by that is, I'll flesh that out a bit, but those are the details that I'm working on right now. So you start from our anthropocentric starting point. I mean, I don't think that is there's no problem with that, right? You have to start somewhere. And, we can start with our own, trying to look at ourselves, observe ourselves, and you develop certain cognitive categories. That's all fine. You also start maybe, with a particular vocabulary, right? Sometimes called the mentalistic vocabulary. And this vocabulary can be filled with, all sorts of human connotations. But it's compatible with different ways of thinking about our original referential intentions, right? So if you use a particular word like decision-making, and if that term was introduced when we were thinking of mind in a Aristotelian way, right, as part of the rational soul or something like that, it could be that when we're using the term decision, we're talking about just the human decision making, or it could be we're using that term to pick out decision making, and the only case that we are maybe aware of at this moment is the human version, but it's totally consistent with that original use, that what we really wanted to pick out decision making, and now we are adjusting the language to satisfy certain an extended extension that includes non-humans as well as humans. And then we adjust both the categories, right, the capacity, our understanding of the capacities, and our understanding of the language, in the light of what's going on empirically, right? So comparative psychology, which is traditionally segregated as kind of non-human psychology, which is kind of bizarre, because comparative biology is not non-human biology. It's just comparing across species. So that is being integrated into psychology, right? And you can base that partly on comparisons. In fact, it'd be hard to do otherwise. And you don't ask things like, can they do what we do, right? Is the human the benchmark, the standard? But instead, you just ask, how is this capacity, decision-making, or planning, or, episodic memory, whatever, what in this particular creature's niche would promote its survival in it. You know, would a planning capacity of some sort help it, right? Does it need it? Does it not need it, right? What particular aspects does it, you know, might it have developed, right? So you're looking at it from, you know, again, this is a non-anthropocentric perspective, not can they do what we do, which is like, of course they can't, because they don't live in our niche, they don't have our bodies, right? But of course, that's not to say that they don't have capacities that we don't, or in different ways, which is obvious in the area of perception. And so we make these comparisons using species neutral criteria, where humans are not the standard, right? And you're able to make, you need this language in order to make non-trivial claims about uniqueness or superiority, for that matter. So let me just say, you know, what I mean by that. So all minds are unique, right? They're all species specific, right? Just like every heart is unique, right? If something has a heart, it's got a heart specific for that body and the environment in which it lives, right? And that means that you're going to have, when you make a claim about uniqueness, it has to be based on, not on this sort of a priori sense of uniqueness, but on some a posteriori sense, where you have standards that are neutral across species. And then it turns out that, you know, maybe this species has this particular thing that no other species has developed, because it has had this problem in its niche that no other, you know, that no other species has faced, right? And it should be noted that, you know, it's impossible to prove, right, uniqueness. All you can say is, you know, to the best of our current knowledge, you know, humans are the only ones that can do such and such, whatever. And then for empirically grounded criteria, you're comparing features, right? So, so a particular capacity might be, you know, better, and I put that in quotes, because scare quotes, because, you know, you can arrange things on a continuum, and it's not a continuum, it's not necessarily a value-laden continuum of better or worse, right? So like, you know, weight, for example, you can have a continuum of weights, right? And it's not like this one is better and this one is worse. It's like, you know, they're all relative to a particular context. And of course, one thing that is better by one measure can be worse by another, right? So for example, right, just to give you a pictorial version, if you take vision as, you know, part of the sensitive soul or perception, you've got different subtypes of vision, right? You have motion perception, you have color vision, and so forth, right? And then if you just look at, not everything has color vision, right? Not everything has vision. So you start with, you know, color vision. And then within that, you've got different ways of dividing up the visual systems that have, that can perceive color. Some of those creatures will be trichromats, right? They'll have 3 different types of photoreceptors. There are different types of, you know, so some have 2. Mantis shrimp are apparently the champions. They have like 12 different types of photoreceptors, right? So you've got a range of different numbers of photoreceptors. And then within the, you know, the subclass of trichromats, you've got your humans, right? You know, what we see. You've got the macaques, or at least the females anyway. You've got marmosets that are also trichromats. And that's really all, you know, you can say. So you can compare these, right? There's all ways to compare, but it's just, you're just, you know, dividing up the capacity into various subtypes until you get to the species level, where, you know, human trichromacy is, like, by definition human, right? But of course, you know, you can, there's still plenty of ways in which you're making a posteriori relationships. With the rational soul, you know, again, I mean, this is, you know, projective in a way. You know, suppose you have a capacity, you know, decision making, and then you're going to have different types of decision making, some more complex, some less. And so one of these types is, you know, the 2-choice decision making that we talked about before, for humans and macaques and fruit flies and so forth. captured by that model for the speed accuracy. And then you have, a lot of different creatures that have their own versions of this type of decision making, right? And it could be that, in some ways, our speed accuracy trade-off is, we may be more accurate at certain speeds than other species, or vice versa, for that matter, right? So that's, so this is the last slide. So, so what you're getting at is trying to develop what I've highlighted here as a kind of intermediate, this is simplified, but there's a bunch of levels of, at which you can group things. Above the, this is the species level, this is the very general level, and this, this is kind of the very general level that, to my knowledge, functionalism has never gotten beyond. But psychologists are getting beyond this, and the idea is, let's analyze these very rough, very general categories that we've had around for thousands of years. There's nothing, sort of essentially wrong with them, but they just need to be made more precise in the light of empirical research and so forth. And we can distinguish between various subtypes, based on all the different sorts of evidence that I mentioned before. And using that, you develop a bunch of concepts and classifications of categories that are species neutral, because they're all above the species level, and yet they're not as, one of the worries is that, it just becomes too liberal, right? Anything can make a decision, right? Well, that's not quite true. I mean, if you think about the decision making, if you just kind of wave your hands and say, well, decision making, it's just this general sort of a thing, and that can go with any concept. The point is that the sciences are actually trying to say more about those, about decision making, or about memory, or about consciousness, or about any of these things, so that you can articulate ways above the species level that capture important generalizations, right, across biology, that will show that there's some continuity, and then you look at the differences, but it's at a species neutral, right, bunch of levels, right? And it's not so broad and, unspecific, and that we might think of in terms of, when we think of functionalism. But it's not so specific that it's already kind of a priori that the humans, are unique. Well, of course they are. Okay, so that's it. So let me just wrap that up. So advances in biology and psychology are forcing us to reconsider the nature of the capacities that our cognitive concepts or mentalistic language is referring to. Our traditional anthropocentric metaphysics is still lingering in various ways, in particular in the way in which, many of us, still, are thinking about cross-species comparisons. And psychology is moving towards, sort of fully embracing this idea that, it's not the human mind, if it is unique or superior in certain ways, that's something that has to be grounded in actual a posteriori discovery. It is no longer grounded by the metaphysics of, the Scala Naturae or Aristotle's, hierarchy of souls. It doesn't have that. So without that, you need to find a better grounding. So that's it. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Should we do it with, maybe we should do it with raising hands through the manage participants thingy on the bottom of the screen. Then I can tell
let's
you
see.
that you can talk.
I say, okay.
Clap, clap.
Okay. Yeah, I see three
Thanks.
hands now. So just, could you manage that, Savas?
Yeah, I can. Yeah. Tell
Thank you.
who can speak. Yeah.
Okay.
Jimena, do you want to start? Jimena?
Yes, sorry, I was unmuting. Thank you so much for the talk, Carrie. So I wanted to ask you a bit about your position on multiple realizability and how does it look from the perspective you're advancing. So your proposal seems to kind of stand away from certain aspects of functionalism. And one of the benefits of functionalism, according to some functionalists, is that they deliver multiple realizability. They can tell us, well, this is the way this specific capacity is realized in all of this very different species. I was just wondering what's your position about that and whether you think, well, no, firstly, I want to listen to what you think about that.
Good. Yeah, so I mean, I think at the end I started, let me see if I can move back a bit here. Yeah, so I think my answer is kind of implicit in this graph. So the idea is that this, for example, limited choice decision making, would be multiply realized fruit flies are not physically like. Okay, so let me go back a step. So multiple realizability is, on one way of thinking, or a standard way of thinking about it, is you have the psychological defined in a particular way, and then you've got the physical defined in a particular way. And of course, that's claim about the mind-body relationship, right? That it's one to many. And what I'm arguing is completely consistent with that. It's exactly what one would expect, is that at the species level, you're going to have different the different bodies, right, which are sharing a particular capacity or function or mind, whatever. So this is basically, you can put this in terms of multiple realizability. Yeah.
Okay. So the idea would be then that this finer grain capacities are the ones that are multiply realized. So this.
Yeah. Okay.
These are
so
the parts, yeah.
Right. So I mean, can you go to the subspecies level for multiple realizability? Probably. But in any case, at the very least, anything above the species level is going to be multiply realized, just by the fact that, the bodies here are all different. And the niches in which they operate are all different.
Okay. Thanks.
And Simon?
Hi, Carrie. Thanks very much for the talk.
Hi.
Just a very simple thought. I was wondering whether you'd thought about the possible application of your line of thought to the development of artificial intelligence. Reason I was thinking about that was that while I was listening to what you were saying about all these models that historically have put human beings as the sort of apex of technology, if you think about the early days of artificial intelligence, it's probably safe to say that they saw the project as being very much to reproduce human intelligence. Right. Think about the Turing test. It's very much geared up to imitating human capacities. Right. I'm guessing that probably you'd feel that things have started to move away from that a little bit in artificial intelligence. It strikes me that there could be two different kinds of issues there about broadening our concepts beyond the ones that we apply to ourselves. One is that we might, because of deep learning systems and so on, develop forms of artificial intelligence where we don't easily understand what it is that they're doing. and we have to come up with ways of trying to understand just what sort of capacities they're employing when they do various things. And the other is more in the other direction of fit, where we might need to be creative in thinking about artificial systems that we might be able to design, and we'd be limited if we just sort of put things in terms of how our own minds work. Anyway, I was just wondering, very general inquiry, just wondering whether you have any thoughts about it.
Those are actually great, great suggestions. You know, typically the AI question is, well, do computers really make decisions and things like that, which is not the question you're asking. I think the potential for you know, so a broader, species neutral. Species neutral, of course, already implies, well, isn't that, biologically centered, right? Even if it's not anthropocentrically centered. And what you're suggesting is that, well, to what extent, can I sort of stop thinking in terms of species and biology and just think even more generally, right? In terms of, any sort of, and this kind of goes back to the multiple realizability question in terms of, silicon versus biological stuff. So I think, I don't know about developing new, there may be developing new capacities. I do think, I sort of mentioned that there's a, you start at an anthropocentric point, right? Looking at ourselves, and I didn't find anything wrong with that. And, from my view, the key step is really just to get at least one level above, the species specific, right? Once you're here, right, then you can, start to maybe think in terms of, what possibilities are there, what spaces in the sort of the cognitive, what points in a particular cognitive space that we've developed that is, has all these various biological species occupying those various spaces in it. Here are empty spaces. Could we build an artificial agent that could, that could fill that part of conceptual space, right? So I think if you can start still with the biological, which is expanded from the human, right? And once you have that, then you can create these sort of comparative spaces where you can identify places that haven't been filled by a biological creature that we know of, and that might be filled by an artificial creature, right? So that's definitely in terms of your second point. The new capacities, I think that's a little bit more difficult, but I think it's essentially the same question. So I'm thinking here of what sorts of physical magnitudes are exploited by biological creatures, right? Well, electromagnetic energy, right? Things like that. But of course, we have found senses that we don't have that other creatures, do have. Sensitivity to variations in electromagnetic waves, and all sorts of physical quantities that we just do not detect at all. And so in that way, we have a space that the senses are transducers for various like light, for example. But of course, that makes you think, well, here's this physical magnitude, that hasn't been exploited that we know of. It's not by us, maybe not no mammals, maybe there's some species somewhere that does. But of course, if you don't find a species that does, and that may be for biological reasons, it doesn't mean that we couldn't design an AI that might exploit that particular magnitude that no biological species can. And so in that way, you would like invent a new sense, right? Because you have this space, you have this point in perceptual space that you can identify as being unoccupied by a biological creature. And I think, that's sort of an analogy to, with cognition. It could be that, there are certain ways of thinking, of processing information that we do, that other species do. And then, somehow we discover some, point in that comparative space that isn't occupied. And it's an open question, is there a biological species that occupies it? Maybe not. Maybe there's biological limits that say no biological creature can think in that way. And then you would have, again, you will have identified a possibility that biology can't occupy, but maybe some artificial agent could. And then you would, again, you'd have a sort of a new capacity or a new version of another capacity that might occupy that place.
Presumably the notion of a niche could still be useful here in something like the way you were using it, because even though artificial intelligences aren't going to have evolutionary niches, they're still usually being designed to perform some purpose. You're trying to build a driverless car or something like that. You'll think about what sort of capacities specifically are needed in order to occupy that kind of niche.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly, that would certainly drive, for example, filling in a particular, so we might, for example, want to build an AI that can, do this, that can, process information in a way that no biological creature can. And we'll try to build that one because we think that doing it that way will help us with this thing that we want. And some other space that's also empty we won't bother with because we don't see any relationship between being able to do it that way and something else that we want, right? So in that case, the niche of the AI is really derivative of our niche, right? It's not a, I mean, that's, I think, where it would, where that would go. So you still have the concept of a niche, but the AI would be kind of a subset. That's not the right word, but it would be derived from our own niche.
Thanks very much.
And Lara?
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. So I was wondering, so with the concept of having species neutral concepts, so I get how you get that when you have already all the empirical evidence and all of that, so it helps you then do categories and all of that. But I'm wondering how you can, in the first place, obtain data that is not already a bit anthropocentric, because it seems to me that like researchers, when they're going to do all the hypotheses and all of that, they're going to like kind of be biased in a way. And here the bias is being like, we're basing this on our own models as like humans with like human minds. So I'm wondering, with this first step, how do you obtain data that enables you to make a species neutral concept?
Yeah. I think that is it's a good, but I think you start from something that's like you know, very anthropocentric, and that has structured comparative psychology. You know, can it do what we do, right? The question that Premack, you know, still asking, right? Which other people aren't asking. And then this would be helpful with an example, I think. So, so episodic memory, all right? I'll give an example because I think it might help clarify this sort of iteration between the theory and the evidence, and the theory and the evidence, you know, all, you know, kind of in a virtuous spiral. You know, Endel Tulving in the 70s, I believe, you know, coming up with the concept of episodic memory, right? Which is memory of some, you know, something that you know, lived in the past, for example. And that was based on data from human subjects, right? And he defined it as, you know, what became known as what, where, when, right? You know, what happened, where, and when. And then in the 90s, Nicola Clayton and her colleagues found evidence of episodic memory for corvids. I think it was Western scrub jays and New Caledonian crows. I forget which species, but they've looked at both, and others, on their ability to remember what, where, and when they cached food, right? So they had very cleverly designed experiments in which some food would spoil and other food would not spoil, you know, after a period of time. And so their preferences in terms of going to find the food that they cached depended on when they had cached it, right? You know, so if a you know, longer period of time had passed, they would not go to the worms, right, which would spoil, but they went to the peanuts, right, which would not spoil at that time, right? So a lot of, you know, and there's been all kinds of, so there you've got, okay, so you start with a bunch of humans, you know, we are all, again, familiar with our own episodic memories. We get a scientist who does memory research, who articulates that as a specific kind of memory, who invents a label that we didn't have for a capacity that we are nevertheless, you know, familiar with from our own case. Then we have somebody in comparative psychology who says, look, by your, you know, we've just found evidence of this in New Caledonian crows, right? It's not a human thing only. It's more general than that, right? And then you get, you know, people pushing back, right? So they're saying, well, you know, if all you do is define episodic memory in terms of what, where, when, you can't really distinguish it from what's called semantic memory, or memory for, you know, fact, right? You know, what happened, where, when, you know, it could be, you know, there was a, you know, I don't know what, you know, a press conference last week in London, right? You know, that's not what we might call an episodic memory. And so people, Tulving and others, will say, it's not just what, where, when, but it's also got this re-experiencing feature where you actually sort of, in some sense, you know, it's part of whatever it is that's, you know, encoded in the memory that you know, you were there, you had, you know, it wasn't just that something happened somewhere at a particular time, but that you were in that situation, and that's what you're remembering, right? And so, up as an animal researcher, there are no sort of agreed upon criteria for when you can ascribe consciousness. One sort of big problem, you know, that you know, it's kind of another talk in a way, but the idea was that if, by the original criteria, the New Caledonian Crows had episodic memory, now with this new re-experiencing feature, the best you can say is, well, they've got episodic-like memory. Because as a scientist, you can't assert that they've got episodic memory if episodic memory has this re-experiencing, this conscious re-experiencing component, and you have no criteria, empirical criteria for saying, and the New Caledonian Crows kind of in a bind. So what do? Well, if you're Nicola Clayton and, again, some of her colleagues, you say, well, let's think about this re-experiencing criteria. We think it's important, it's essential to episodic memory. We want to distinguish that from semantic memory. We agree that this should be part of what it is to be episodic memory. But let's think about what re-experiencing involves. And that's where they say, well, at the very least, it has to involve some sort of a perspective taking on whatever occurs, right? So there's sort of a relationship between, the creature and whatever it is that went on, that later on they remember, right? So one of the examples they give is, if somebody said, I remember being in that job interview, and you said, well, where were you sitting at the table? No idea. Where was the person who was talking to you? No idea, right? I mean, if that was the sort of response that they gave, we would doubt. We would say, well, I don't know, are you really having an episodic memory of it, or do you just sort of know semantically that there was an interview that happened at this particular time, and maybe you were there, right? So that's this perspective thing that is, essential, seems to be an important component, at least, of what it is to re-experience. And so you sort of develop a conception of re-experiencing that says, okay, now we've got something that we can work with empirically, and we can somehow test, design experiments to see, do New Caledonian Crows exhibit our operationally that episodic memory experiment, right? So in this way, you see how we've kind of gone with a certain theoretical anthropocentric beginning. We do some experiments, somebody else does a different experiment with a different species, the people modify the theory, and then the comparative people will, again, let's think about this theory in a way that enables us to test it in non-human species. That's the important thing is, how do you conceptualize something in a way that, doesn't, presume something, only humans can do, right? And then you test that and so forth. And so you end up with a concept, I mean, this is still in development, but you end up with a concept of episodic memory where you've got this re-experiencing element, but it's not, there's attempt to try to define it in a way that does not rule out a priori the idea that non-humans can exhibit it.
Okay, that makes it so much clearer. Thank you so much.
Derek?
Thanks. This is in a way a follow-up on that question, and also I think a follow-up on Jimena's question. So I have kind of a very general question and a more specific motivation for that question. So the very general question is, you said that this should make us rethink the metaphysics, but I wasn't quite clear on what the metaphysical picture that we're supposed to arrive at is. So that's the general question. And the reason why I'm a little bit worried about this is because it looks like the kind of evidence that you're focused on Although you did mention neuroscientific evidence at one point, but the main kind of evidence that you're looking at is behavioral. So you're interested in these kind of cases where we want to know about decision making, and so we cook up a way of operationalizing decision making. And then so we've got a behavioral test, and we roll that out in a bunch of species and see how they do. And I'm worried that if that's the evidence that we're looking at, the kind of metaphysics that we're going to end up with is a behaviorist metaphysics. That's what all of these cases of quote unquote decision making are going to have in common. They're in effect a certain kind of disposition to behave under certain circumstances that we specify.
Good. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, I didn't, you know, other than the fruit fly example, you know, I really didn't go into any of the, you know, sort of either genetics or neural stuff, you know, going on. But that is definitely part of the mix. So just, you know, again, a very, you know, very brief example is, you know, in a lot of memory research, we know in human beings that it involves, you know, the hippocampus, you know, and of course there's, you know, different areas of the hippocampus and so forth. Birds have a hippocampal formation. They don't really have the same sort of structure, but they have something analogous, right? And so, you know, one of the bases of, you know, it's sort of, you know, a lot of the behavioral stuff will kind of take for granted certain analogies or, you know, homologies across, you know, mammalian or vertebrate species, for example. That will just kind of be in the background as far as the behavioral tests are going, you know, because psychologists are mainly, although not exclusively, focused on behavior, right? That's, you know, because that's how they operationalize the cognitive. But they aren't, I mean, as many, you know, psychological and brain sciences departments are, they are integrating the neural stuff. It's just that a lot of the experiments that the psychologists, you know, developmental psychologists, comparative psychologists, cognitive psychologists, they're sort of focusing on the behavior, but it's not as if there isn't neuroscientific evidence kind of doing its work, you know, behind the scenes for them. But of course, there will be other people, you know, both doing, say, neuroimaging experiments or other types of, you know, deficit studies, things like that, or lesion studies that are looking at the neurobiological underpinnings of various sorts of, you know, capacities that we measure standardly through psychological. It's more I mean, that's a whole complicated thing because the neuroscience itself will depend on behavior, right? Because, you know, you poke a piece of the brain and you're looking for something to change, right? You cut out a piece of the brain and you want to see what is lost, right? So there's an intimate connection there that you know, I don't mean to, I'm certainly not denying it. And so that's, you know, sort of when I said the new metaphysics it's going to be physicalist, say, in a very broad sense, which will include but not be exclusive to behavior. It's just that behavior is like, you know, where the rubber hits the road, even for neuroscience, right? If you toggle something in the brain and it makes no difference, then the default inference could be false, but the default inference is that part of the brain has nothing to do with that, with, you know, that capacity that we measure by looking at that behavior. Does that answer your question? So it's still broadly physicalist, and it's just going to be all of that stuff.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Nick?
Hi guys, is this audio better? Because I found a headset in a drawer.
This is very loud and clear. Yeah.
Okay, great, cool. Thanks very much for the talk. It was really interesting. Definitely lots to think of, and lots of things that I think are addressing really problematic ways in which functionalism has gone before. So I think that's really cool. My question is about other extensions that this might do for problems in theory of mind. So with more basic styles of functionalism, which are completely anthropocentric and aren't using this pluralism that you've illustrated, one of the major objections is not accounting for qualia, in as much as we tend to think that there's something that the aboutness of experiencing mind might tell us about what it is, and functionalism is often criticized for kind of not getting that right. And this is sort of a related issue to the issue that Lara brought up earlier about not repeating the same kinds of prejudices potentially from when you're gathering your data. But either way, one thing that this could suggest then is that if you're going to extend sort of like the anthropocentric functionalism and then have this new pluralistic net instead, maybe you could also extend the problem of qualia to and take it a lot more seriously and a lot more broadly than considered before with other animals, in terms of it's not there's this specific thing that humans have in terms of what the aboutness that we experience is, but it's just what is it like to be an animal, as it were. So I wonder if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I was I'm taking a particular. There's been work on this that I was reading last year that I used in my philosophy of mind course, and I'm blanking on the authors. Although I think Tim Crane might have been one of the people. Well, to go back even farther, so Kathleen Akins, you might recall, had a very interesting article in response to Nagel. What is it like to be boring and myopic? Does that ring a bell? But in any case,
he did the bat one as well, right?
Yeah, he did. Nagel did. What is it like to be a bat, and that's sort of the what it's like stuff, which still is still persisting, and it's we haven't really moved a whole lot beyond that. But in any case, he did capture something that is still useful, I think. But anyway, so her response, what is it like to be boring and myopic? Was, well, if we look at the bats' neurobiology and their behavior, right, the whole gamut there, it's very unlikely that they perceive objects, right? These sort of, permanent, our ordinary metaphysics of, permanent things in space, right? She said, whatever it is that they, is like to be a bat is not going to be in relation to a space in which there are, sort of enduring objects, right? That's not going to be what it's like, right, to be a bat, right? And so what I'm mentioning her article for, and there's more recent stuff on this, is the idea that qualia. We can certainly expect, if non-humans have, qualia or are conscious, we should expect that their qualia and their consciousness, their subjective experience is, like anything else that they have, is going to be specific to their, sort of their bodies and the niches that they live in and how they developed. Of course, there's still the epistemic problem is, first of all, how do you know that they're conscious or having a subjective experience or qualia at all? You know, do they feel pain, for example? And even if you had a way, you know, that everybody agreed on, you know, it's not like people don't have measures. You know, the question is, are they, you know, generally accepted? Because when you don't have verbal report, everything kind of is like, oh, what do we do, right? And that goes for humans as well, right? But even if you had some sort of a measure, either behavioral and neural combined, in which you could say, yeah, you know, these octopi, they do appear to be conscious. What is it that they experience, right? That's an even, you know, kind of a harder question. And, you know, that may be something that we'll, you know, never be able to really fully know. But I don't want to be a Mysterian about it, where, you know, we can't possibly know, you know, it's just not a possibility for us. You know, I see no reason to be a Mysterian about consciousness. But there's certainly reasons now that, you know, we aren't able to solve that problem yet. You know, people are trying. But getting from, you know, once you get rid of verbal report, and people, of course, have always questioned whether verbal report is actually sufficient, you know, because if you had a zombie, right, you know, or a very advanced robot AI who walked and talked and did everything just like a human being, you know, how would you know whether they were conscious? Right, so that it's a difficult problem, even problem, right? And I don't see that problem as, you know, sort of going away soon. I think a lot of people are working on it. One thing I should add is there is a kind of epistemic asymmetry that I think is kind of part of the anthropocentric, you know, framework, that I think also, you know, needs to be changed. And this is, you know, we all know the other minds problem. It starts from you know, and extends to other beings, whether they're human or AI or non-human or whatever. And you know, when philosophers and psychologists, you know, talk about consciousness, they've already accepted that all, you know, humans, except for people in coma, you know, who knows about infants, are conscious, right? In other words, we just kind of grant that all human beings are conscious, you know, have consciousness. On what basis? That's a really good question, right? That's a really good question. What's the asymmetry is that the other mind's problem is acute, and yet we kind of give ourselves a buy. But when it comes to, you know, our dogs or you know, chimps or, you know, anything non-human, suddenly there's this you know, unbridgeable barrier for some people and for many people. And it's that asymmetry in terms of solving the other mind's problem that I think is part of the anthropocentrism that needs to be overcome, particularly in the area of qualia and consciousness.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. Yeah, that's exactly what it sounds like this could be able to do. So that's really cool. Thank you.
And Katarina?
Hi, thank you so much. Can you hear me? Oh, okay. Does it work? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, sorry. So I think this goes back to Lara and Derek's question, and maybe Mana as well. So I do understand that if species neutral, non-anthropocentric capacities and concepts amount to having capacities and concepts that just don't only work for humans, then I do understand this picture. However, it seems that there might be some anthropogenetic stuff still going on there in the way we start with the categories. So thinking of what we look at as being decision making, for example, right? So we look at behavior and then we say, well, there is some such thing as a decision or a choice there. And I don't know how, so I do understand that probably farther down the tree, that kind of feeds back to how we understand decision making to begin with as a category, right? But just how can we get rid of something that might be very anthropogenetic, that kind of comes with what phenomena or what types of phenomena we're looking at, or how we carve out what we want to look at in behavior? See my point? Might be kind of a weird question. But
No. I do, and I think it's a fundamental issue is how we individuate tasks or behavior. And this is a problem. This has come up like in the functionalism literature. You know, what are the inputs, right? What are the outputs? That's the way it's put. But I think it is a big issue. You know, how are we operationalizing? You know, when is it? You know, if a slime mold is making a decision, you know, just to give you an example. First of all, they make the decisions are, the time frame is like several hours to make a decision, because that's how slime molds, you know, they have, every species has its own different, you know, temporal frame, right? We operate in a particular, you know, temporal frame when humans are, you know, operate outside, you know, they either move much slowly or much faster. Our attributions of mind get kind of screwed up. But every species has its own spatio-temporal scale of operation. And for slime molds, you know, to make a decision, it counts as, you know, moving towards a particular food source, right? So they have, so the setup will be that they have, they can choose between different percentages of agar that has oatmeal in it. So what happens is you know, you start with the slime mold in a particular position in a basically a maze type apparatus, and then you put different food sources at the ends of the different arms, and they will have different quality. So there's just the plain old agar, which is like, I'll eat it, okay. There's agar that has oatmeal in it, which is preferred by slime mold. And so you can, you know, you can change the percentage of oatmeal in a particular dish of agar. And so they make a decision as to, you know, which one they should go to. And the way they do that is they, you know, move over several hours into the arm that is in effect their decision. And when the slime mold has like moved completely into the arm, that counts as, you know, okay, it's made its decision, right? And a fast slime mold does this in like 5 hours, you know, which from our perspective is like, you know, super slow motion. In fact, it doesn't even count. So that's how decision making has been operationalized for slime mold. Now you might say, and you know, it's perfectly fine to be skeptical, is that a decision, right? You know, this is where, you know, people will dispute, you know, they're not really making a decision. Why not? Well, they might say specifically, you know, what, you know, growing into that arm of the maze doesn't count, right? And of course, then the researchers will say, well, why would it not count? Slime mold move at their own time scale. We are able to distinguish between, or they are able to distinguish between really good food sources and really bad food sources. And we can change the conditions of light, which they don't like, so that we can, you know, they can choose to, when it's dark, they'll go for the rich stuff. But if the rich stuff is in an environment with a lot of light, they will go for the less rich stuff, the less preferred stuff, right? So, so this is where, again, the empirical research and the theoretical pushback and the criticism and skepticism about the interpretation of results is all part of the, just the messy work of trying to figure out, what's a good way to operationalize, doesn't have arms and legs and that sort of thing. Has too many arms and legs, an octopus.
Right. I think I might not have made my point clear. I think it's an even more fundamental issue I'm having. So it's not about how you operationalize it. It's about that we look at the category decision, having all these things that now are defined as decisions, right? From the fruit fly to the human. But that it is this stuff that we're looking at to begin with might already have some anthropogenetic stuff in there. That we sort of look at behavior in a certain way, that we kind of give it some telos that has to do with there having been a choice maybe or something like that. So that kind of stuff. It's a bit more coming from the realism, anti-realism thing, right?
Okay.
Coming more from the
in other words,
science.
I see. So in other words, just to be clear, when I, choose the coffee rather than the tea or something like that, am I making a decision?
Is maybe that still something that's driving us when we look at the fruit flies, because that is how we sort of operate, that is how we carve out behavior in terms of decisions.
Right. So you have, again, this is a particular kind, this is two-choice decision, A or B. Decisions that we make, sort of all the time, often without a lot of cognizing going on. You just kind of reach for the one you want. So there is a skeptical question, with anti-realism, which would say, or even a form of behaviorism, where all I did was I got these stimuli and I reached for this particular one. I didn't reach for the other, and there's nothing like there's no such thing as like decision make some hidden variable or something that the behavior does not license the inference to the inner state, right? Are you questioning whether one should be a realist at all about cognitive concepts, or is it just we're allowed to be realists for humans, but we're not allowed for the non-humans?
No, it seems just that, well, it's taking up too much time. Sorry, I'm taking up too much time. It's a little bit different still. Sorry, it might just be a confused question. Thank you.
We don't have anybody else, so if you want to continue, it's fine.
Yeah. No, I do want to understand so it's not a general anti-realism about the cognitive.
No, so it's just the idea that, okay, so there are different ways of, okay, let's take some examples from the social sciences. It probably won't work, but let's talk about poverty, right? There's different ways of cashing out poverty.
Poverty.
But we're looking at a certain phenomenon that we define in a certain way, right? Now, we could do it completely different as well, right? And so maybe going back to the decision making, maybe there is something about us cashing things out in terms of decision making that have some anthropogenetic stuff in the background going on, that's informing how we choose methods and models and how we operationalize our research with the fruit fly.
And the humans, for that matter.
And with humans, of course, right.
Yeah.
So I guess the question just was something like, can we really get rid of the anthropogenetic bit completely? Because it might still sort of be a bias in a way that Lara might, maybe in Lara's way, it might still be a bias that's informing how we approach things as a decision-making process. Even if we kind of change time frames and say it's 5 hours instead of a minute or so.
Yeah, I think this actually goes back to Simon's question about the AI.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's the same, it's basically the same question is, you know, you do start somewhere, and admittedly it's anthropocentric and wrong with that. And it could be that, you know, we end up with something, you know, biocentric, you know, something that is, again, so you can get away from, you know, I sort of explain, you know, by an iterative of, you know, theory experiment, you can, you know, kind of bootstrap your way to a more non-anthropocentric way of thinking and of defining capacities and concepts. And your worry is that you haven't left the human behind. You may have left the human, specifically human, behind without leaving the specifically biological behind, right? And then the question is, well, can you ever leave the biological behind, right?
Right.
And that's where you sort of say, well, you know, if you can develop a conceptual space in which, you know, you can sort of identify where the gaps are, you know, then maybe, you know, then you can sort of see, you know, kind of step back from even the biological, right? You know, and I think at that point it's just a matter of, you know, what is the psychology you want, right?
Right.
But I don't, yeah, I think it's essentially the same thing I sort of said to Simon was,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
We are out of time, but does anyone want to make a last brief question? A small question? Any last comment?
Jared is clapping already.
I see a hand.
Thank you. Yeah. 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 Thanks
That's the clap reaction, I think, that you're seeing.
Oh, okay. Some people clap. I think Maria Jimena has her hand up.
Yeah. Can I ask a tiny question? Yeah,
yeah.
I will also clap, but can I ask?
Yeah.
I was just wondering whether you think there might be any disadvantage, either theoretical or metaphysical, in like having an overpopulation of type.
What do you mean, an overpopulation of type?
Yeah, so I'm wondering, like, we get to this point in where we have a very specific taxonomy in such a way that actually that taxonomy delivers different types at a lower level, at the lowest level, perhaps before specifying each species, before going to each species. And we might have reason to think that, well, I don't know, plant vision is significantly different to human vision, right? So let's call them vision 1, vision 2. Is there any problem in just accepting, these are just different types, they come from, like, we classify them in a similar, in a tree, right? We classify them similarly, as similar, but we'll just take them as different types. There's no theoretical reason to bring them together as belonging to one kind.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah. I mean, this is actually a debate, you know, in biology, and you know, I think, you know, the short answer is, you know, it'll be the ones that are most predictive and explanatory, you know, for any given, you know, research project. But just to draw the analogy to biology, so, you know, the species are pretty much, you know, people think, yeah, you know, we're realists about species exist. But above the species level, there's a lot of debate about what the right clades, you know, what the right grouping should be, right? So there's the kind of a traditional biological hierarchy, you know, taxonomic hierarchy. It's like 8 or 9 levels. I forget, you know, so like, I'm probably not using the kingdom, you know, order, family, you know, genus, species, you know, and so forth, right? So that's the traditional Linnaean hierarchy, which bottoms out, you know, pretty much at the species, and then you might get some variation within that for subspecies and so forth. Apparently, I mean, and this is just, you know, from what I understand from philosophers of biology, although, you know, in general sense, the Linnaean hierarchy is still, you know, pretty dominant. There's a lot of debate about how things should be grouped, you know, above the species level. What are the and of course there's the species and it's or something like that, right? So there's no commitment to groups above the species level, the way there is a commitment, you know, ontological commitment, you might say, to the species level. So it's entirely possible that that sort of debate is going to be, you know, reiterated ecology with, you know, what are the real groups here, right? And that's not, yeah, I mean, which ones are the ones we could, which is a better, maybe there's a better way of organizing things, right? And I think that's just going to be, you know, A, it's going to be debated for a while, and B, it could be, I'm not sure that there will be, I certainly can't say a priori that, you know, that there will always, you know, that somehow at the end of the story, the anti-realists will have been, you know, put aside, right? I mean, I suspect that there will always be anti-realists, you know, for any of these groupings. And, you know, whether that problem is going to be worse in psychology than it is in biology, I don't know. I mean, I don't know, but it's definitely going to be there, right?
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Good.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Great. Okay, well, yeah, right. This is, how do I clap for everybody?
These reactions at the bottom.
Yeah, yeah, right. Well, thanks everybody. I appreciate your attendance, and your questions are really good. And if, you know, if you have any other further things, you know, please you know, you can find me easily at my University of Iowa email address. And yeah, any further thoughts that come to you, just let me know, because this is all kind of work in progress. So very good.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So,
Thank you.
okay, so what do I do here?
Good day.
I press a button of some sort to say goodbye, right?
Could end the meeting, yeah.
Yeah.
Bottom right-hand corner is leave meeting, and then Savas has control over the overall meeting, I think.
Okay. So, all right, well.
And the clapping reaction is under reaction in the middle.
Yeah. Bye.
Right,
Yeah.
okay.
Have a good day.
See you then, people. Bye.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.